What would happen if if a lot of people stopped paying their credit card debt?
Well, the way that our system works is that it more or less goes along on deep trends, whether technology or other trends, until there's some kind of crisis. We had a crisis in 2008. That was a very particular kind of crisis where a not very clever move by, I think, a not very clever Treasury Secretary at the time decided he would bankrupt a company he didn't like. It was Hank Paulson, who came from Goldman Sachs, not my part of the Sachs family I need to explain. So I just want to be clear, different branch, I suppose. And he didn't like Lehman Brothers, so he decided literally one weekend, rather than try to sell off Lehman Brothers, he was going to close it down. And it was a kind of lame-brained operation, and he created one of the greatest financial crises of modern history.
Wait.
Yes.
You think Paulson created the '08 meltdown because he had a grudge against Lehman?
Yeah, basically. He wanted to teach them a lesson. He thought they were lazy, terrible firm, which they may well have been, by the way. But he decided in 2008, there was a housing bubble, and the housing bubble was breaking, and a lot of the investment banks were on the edge because they had invested in crappy mortgages, and that they were trying to securitize. So it was a fragile situation. We would have had a normal downturn for sure. We would have had a recession. But Paulson decided in September 2008 that rather than do another rescue where you take a weak bank and you may add some public money and then you sell it off to a buyer. And there was a potential buyer for Lehman Brothers. It was Barclays, a British bank. And the USG government could have put in a bit of money or taken some of the bad stuff off the balance sheets and given the rest to Barclays. But Paulson wanted to do two things. He wanted to teach Lehman Brothers a lesson. I believe, we can't prove this stuff, but Lehman was kind of a rival of Goldman, and I think there was that personal bit from what I know. But also, Paulson thought, we should show the markets we can be tough and firm and let the markets determine the outcome. So he said, we're not going to do any patch up to get Lehman into somebody else's hands. We're going to just let it close, let it go bankrupt. And that was September 14th, 2008. And when the markets opened the next day, he had triggered one of the greatest financial crises of history, actually, within...
Why have I never heard the story?
Maybe they didn't want to advertise how unbelievably incompetent they were. But this was complete incompetence. And by the way, it was incompetence of the whole economic team. It included the Fed, New York Fed, Washington, the Treasury. This was a crisis that absolutely was not only human-made, but you can pinpoint the hour and the day and the event. Because the point I was making, because you asked me a question about...
Sorry, my jaw's open. I mean, I'm kind of interested in the subject.
You
read a book on it, I guess, and...
You asked me a question about credit card debt, and the
No,
point,
but that's just
and
so interesting.
I was making a digression.
Is this widely... Well, I'm digressing again, but is this widely known?
It's not very well understood. It's not a secret, but I can explain why it's not understood, but in a moment. But the point is, a financial panic is a specific kind of event. It is the same event as when people are trampled running out of a stadium.
Yes.
Okay? So that happens once every, I don't know how many 100 football games. Something happens. There's a fight, people start running and then trampling, and then lots of people get crushed. So that's a specific event. It's a panic. In finance, the same thing can happen. And financial panics happen on occasion throughout history, and you can identify them. And usually there is a cause that is a trigger of it. But with a panic, like a stampede out of a stadium, the cause is completely incommensurate with the outcome. In other words, the cause may be that someone punched someone else, and that started commotion, and 1,000 people got trampled in the end. So the cause was some stupid little thing, but then it led to a cascade of disaster. That's exactly what a financial panic is, or a bank run. I don't know if anybody ever remembers my favorite movie of my youth and for my children, Mary Poppins. But Mary Poppins is a children's story, of course, that has a bank run in it, where the young boy wants to get his 2 pence out of the bank, and there's resistance, and he starts screaming, "You won't give me my money back," and then everyone runs to the bank to take their money out, and the bank fails. And it's a panic. So Hank Paulson made a panic in September 14, 2008. And he made it deliberately. The action was deliberate. The outcome was not deliberate. He had no idea what he was about to do, which was to create this rush for the exits by all banks on all loans all over the world within 3 days. And that's what he created. And it created the biggest economic downturn since the Great Depression itself. And that's, by the way, an interesting, very interesting story also, because just like a panic can create something that's completely incommensurate with any fundamental reason, but it leads to a total disaster, the opposite can sometimes happen also, which I was reminded because the Great Depression, which was this calamitous event, in the days up to Franklin Roosevelt's inauguration, which was March 4th, 1933, there was a bank panic in the United States. And by the time that Roosevelt became president on March 4th, 1933, the whole U.S. banking system had closed down because everyone had rushed to the banks to withdraw their money, just like in Mary Poppins, but it was all over the U.S. So the whole U.S. banking system was closed when Franklin Roosevelt became president on March 4th, 1933. And with a smile and a tilt of his head, he said, "And I firmly believe that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself." And with those words, people stopped panicking. And they went back and put their money in the bank. And within a few days, the U.S. banking system reopened. And it was Franklin Roosevelt's personality and his spirit and his tilt of the head and his smile and his phrase that it's only fear that we have to fear that undid the panic. After that, many reforms were made, like the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation and the SEC and public reporting, and many things were done. But the banks actually opened on a matter of words. So you asked me a question, why did I make this big digression? Because financial markets are capable of creating all sorts of disasters. And the first rule that you learn is be careful. Don't let liquidity mess you up. Don't let panics destroy things. Hank Paulson apparently didn't know any of that. And he walked the world into a $10 or $20 trillion disaster loss by a deliberate action, because there were better ways.
He never got, that's a absolutely remarkable story. Remarkable because it happened in front of all of us.
Yeah.
I was paying, 30% attention. I mean, I actually had to sell my house that year. So, it affected me and a lot of people, me less than most, but still it affected everybody. And he was Treasury Secretary and a famous guy, and he's still kind of a famous guy.
Yeah, he still is.
No one ever...
Probably a nice guy, by the way.
Yeah. I do doubt that, but I don't know.
I don't know.
Trying to let my bigotries affect my view, but why does he not carry the stain of that with him?
The reason is, strangely enough, people don't understand what I just described in general, though there is a group. I'm a finance economist, so I study this throughout history, and I've studied these events, and I've watched them actually close up because I've often been called into crisis situations. So I'm very attuned to them. And another example, and then I'll give you an answer, was in the summer of 1997, when Asia experienced a full-fledged financial crisis that you may remember, called, we know it as the Asian financial crisis. What happened? What happened was Thailand devalued the Thai baht. Well, so, you want to put your thumb in your mouth and suck your thumb. What difference could that possibly make? It triggered a panic. And the IMF addressed it, the International Monetary Fund addressed it in completely the wrong way, because both the 2008 and the 1997, or the 1933 story that I told you about Franklin Roosevelt, if you're in a stampede or a panic and you say, "You see, you're so immoral. You created this disaster. We are living in sin. This is why our banking system has failed," you will do nothing but crush what you have left standing. But if you say, "Oh my God, we just had a panic," you don't have to panic. Fundamentals are fine. We've got this under control. The only thing we have to fear is fear itself. Yeah, you could calm down the situation.
So this is not a matter of math. This is human psychology.
This is understanding what's going on and then responding to it in an appropriate way. Now, it happens, and now we're getting really into the weeds of economics. My field is macroeconomics. So I look at an economy as a whole, and I study business cycles or crises or ups and downs of the economy. So to go back to 2008, we were going to have a recession. A recession means that the people stop buying houses, and there's unemployment, and the unemployment may go, from 4% to 7%, and economic growth may turn negative for 2 or 3 quarters, and there's a lot of pain, and people can't make ends meet, and so forth. But then the economy recovers in maybe 18 months or so. That's not what happened in 2008. What happened in 2008 was a prolonged, deep crisis with soaring unemployment, with bankruptcies, with mega bailouts, with the whole world economy suffering. There was no reason for that bigger outcome. The normal thing would have been a recession. Why a recession? Because there was too much liquidity and deregulation of the mortgage markets, and there was a bubble, and the bubble burst, and housing went into recession, and we had another business cycle. Okay, that would have been the normal. But we had Hank Paulson on September 14, 2008, pulling the plug on an investment bank that triggered a panic among all banks, so that by Monday morning, when the markets opened, first there were legal problems in Britain because Lehman had a branch in Britain that under British rules created lots of problems. But then the investment banks started to call in their loans because they said, "Oh, hell, all hell's breaking loose." And the stampede started. That led to the mega downturn. So then you ask, well, how was this interpreted afterwards? Because that's your question. Why isn't this standard? Well, the answer is that it was all explained as the downturn from the housing bubble, not the panic caused by the bankruptcy of Lehman. So in other words, what would have been a normal downturn became the narrative for what was the calamitous crisis. In other words, it was misexplained And that's how they like to explain it, because Hank Paulson did not want to stand up the next day and say, oh shit, I really did that wrong. That was a stupid thing to do. I didn't understand how financial markets work, even though I had been the lead of Goldman Sachs. I really messed these things up. Ben Bernanke at the Fed did not want to say, my God, that weekend we really should have buffed this up to get it out to Barclays. And he said afterwards, I couldn't have sold it anyway. I didn't have the legal authority. And then a scholar at Johns Hopkins wrote a long book explaining very carefully, yes, Ben, you could have done it differently. We could have avoided this crisis. It could have been sold to Barclays. You had all the authority in the world to do it, and so on. So the narrative that I'm giving, is the explanation that I'm giving, was hidden from view, partly because of confusion, partly because when a crisis happens, you want to blame it on fundamental things. So it was easy to say, oh, that mortgage market was, there a lot of cheating, and there was a lot of cheating, and all the securitization made messes and so forth. So you want to say, oh, if there's a downturn or if there's a panic, it's because you're sinners. And so that's a normal narrative. And no one wants to take responsibility. God, I really messed up.
But it's important to know why things go wrong so you can take steps to prevent them from going wrong again in the same way.
Well, again, this is now really getting into the weeds of my profession. But as a macroeconomist, I'll just, if anyone's interested, but this is really getting technical, we have a standard theory that we teach at university level about why downturns happen. And it's a theory that's attributed to John Maynard Keynes, who was a really great, brilliant British economist that I've learned a whole career from in his writings. But John Maynard Keynes wrote famously about the Great Depression, and he said the cause of the Great Depression is this particular phenomenon we call the decline of aggregate demand, that people stop buying, and that leads to a downturn. So maybe they stop buying houses, so that leads to a downturn. So that's called an aggregate demand shortfall. And the problem is that all subsequent business cycles after John Maynard Keynes then became interpreted through that lens that he had established, because he was such a wonderful personality and such a fascinating writer and thinker, that his interpretation of the Great Depression became the standard way to interpret any event that followed afterwards. And my experience, because I happen to have the experience of working in very acute crises, like hyperinflations or debt crises or financial panics, which became my thing for a while in my career, I saw, oh, those are really quite different from how Keynes described the Great Depression. These are phenomena of their own right. They're very particular. A banking panic is not just a decline of demand, it's a panic. We need to understand the panic. Now, I'm not the first to observe that by any means. There's a whole theory and history about this. But it's kind of, I made a comparison 20 some years ago, that because I'm jealous of my wife, she's a medical doctor and an extraordinarily excellent medical doctor. And she would see a patient and do a diagnosis and save the kid because she's a pediatrician. And I thought, oh God, if only an economist could actually save something, But she did what she was trained to do, called a differential diagnosis, which means you see a fever, it's not one thing. You have to figure out what's the cause.
Right.
So I came to understand, you see an economic crisis, you better understand the cause of it, not just the standard narrative. And so for me, I'm very much attuned to what really caused that event. Well, Hank You caused that event in this case on September 14th, 2008. I'm sorry to say it. Don't want to make it, personal, but you really made a mess at that point. This was not just world markets having their thing. This was something that we made a mistake. You should understand that.
So given everything you know about the current U.S. economy and the current, guardians of it, stewards of it, what do you think the next crisis will look like?
First, we're in an ongoing crisis, but it's a slow-moving crisis. So a crisis doesn't have to be an immediate event. A crisis can be a set of unsolved problems that persist and are difficult, and that, I think, has been true for a long time. Our economy does not work for half our country.
Yes.
That, to my mind, is a crisis.
Agreed.
And it's not news. It's not something that started this year or under the Biden administration or under any recent administration. It's been decades. Why did it happen? It happened because I think, actually, this is another long digression, but technology changed and jobs that people used to do, good working class high school grad jobs, no longer existed. The assembly line ended except for robots.
Yes.
And I toured robotic factories for 30 years. This isn't something new. Already 30 years ago, I went to a Toyota plant, probably 30 years ago. There were no people in the whole building. It was a Japanese plant, probably in the 1990s, because it was all incredibly sophisticated robots. What I found fascinating about it, by the way, was that every car that was coming off the line was custom, specification. So a truck followed by a sedan, followed by, two-seater and so on. The robots were just programmed. They could put together any different thing and the right parts would come in and it wasn't, super standardized. It was a very sophisticated plant, but it meant that the auto workers didn't have jobs. So those jobs had already gone away. Jobs in agriculture went away 75 years ago. We have 1% of our workforce provides the food for the whole country.
Yes.
And for a lot of the world. 1%, because agriculture became so mechanized, so proficient, and so on. And when I spoke to a farmer a few years ago, he said, yeah, I still like to ride the tractor. Of course, I read a book when I do, because the tractor drives itself. It puts the fertilizer on the field exactly in the right places. Everything is geographically specified and so on. But the point is, the fundamental technology of our world changed already 50 years ago, not just with the ChatGPT. This is a long, ongoing story. And it meant, actually, high school wasn't going to cut it for demand for workers because what was more than 20% of the workforce, which was manufacturing back in 1980 or so, is now less than 10% of the workforce. And that's not, by the way, because of China or because of Mexico. That's because of robots. That's because of automation. That's because of digital technologies. That's because of a sophisticated economy. So this trend has been deep. It's been widening for decades. It has led to two societies. The professionals are mainly in cities, and they're mainly in the Democratic Party, and they're mainly doing rather well, thank you. The people that are in working class, well, they're in rural areas or semi-rural areas or suburban areas in many places and not doing very well. And that's been going on for a long time. And I call that a crisis. It's a crisis of our country. What do? In response? Well, we go to war, we overthrow governments, we do all sorts of things. We call ourselves the greatest country in the world, and we let our infrastructure go to hell. We didn't address these issues, and we didn't face up to the question of, how to share better, how to address these challenges in a more effective way, or what are we going to do about it? What are the underlying trends? And now we're going to face a new wave with our even more remarkable artificial intelligence, which is actually going to wipe out lots more jobs. And that's going to be a very, very big deal. And this time, a lot of professional jobs, by the way, because, frankly, if I need to find sources or to look at what's been written about a topic, what used to take me, and I was hired to do it, days or weeks to, go through journals and literature and books, I can do in 1 minute now. On just asking a question to my favorite chat program, and so this is going to cause even more disruptions. It also means, interestingly, of course, that a few people who own these platforms and systems are, getting a wealth that is simply beyond any imagining and any prior experience in the history of the world. I looked up as I was arriving today's net worth of the top 10 net worth people of the United States. So with Elon number one. You know what? Or not of the United States, of the world, because I think one is foreign. I think maybe of the top 10. You know what? The 10 richest people. 10 people, just 10, what their net worth is today, $1.7 trillion. 10 people. This is a funny world. You've got tens of millions of people who can't pay the bills, can't fill a dental appointment, can't fill a drug prescription. You have 10 people, many of them really creative, by the way. But even if you're really creative, Elon, I think today, and I love Elon for lots of things and know him and admire his genius. But he's got 200 billion something bucks. It's interesting. The economy is changing in fundamental ways. And it's bifurcating may not even be the right word. In other words, dividing in two. It may be dividing in even more fractured ways. And we need to figure out what we're going to do about that as a society. And we're not figuring that out. And also, because of the way our political system works, we don't want to do anything that would cost anything, because government doesn't accept war. Government doesn't want to raise any revenues, even on people who couldn't use their wealth in a million lifetimes. So we're a little bit stuck. And all of this, the reason I mention all of this is that normal economics, the way we discuss this issue is as bad as the way we discuss the wars and everything else. It's at an extremely superficial level that is all about, will growth be 3.1% next quarter or 2.9%? Or is the economy in a slow patch, or will it pick up? Where the deepest changes of our lives are underway, where technology is transforming everybody's jobs, everybody's lives, where if you don't have the right kind of job, you're living 8 or 10 years less than your neighbor that has the right kind of job, that's the kind of society we have right now. And those are issues that are really important, but where do you discuss them? You're not going to hear about that on the campaign. You're not going to hear about that in almost all of the financial journalism, because financial journalism is mainly about what will the markets do? Will the Fed raise interest rates, lower interest rates? Those are not completely uninteresting, but I find them completely boring. So I have to say,
too.
even though that was what I went into to begin with, but I thought of how much fun it would be to turn dials and make economies go up and down, but it turns out to be the least interesting part of the whole story.
Jeffrey Sachs, I do think at some point you should sit down and figure out 10 stories over the past 30 years that have been mistold or misunderstood in the public's view of them, and just do 4 hours each as a university lecture and put them online and just make higher education irrelevant.
As usual, Tucker, great idea.
Thank you. Jeff Sachs, I appreciate it.
So it turns out that YouTube is suppressing our show. I know, shocking that in an election year, with everything at stake, Google would be putting its thumb on the scale and preventing you from hearing anything that the people in charge don't want you to hear. But it turns out it's happening. So what can you do about it? Well, we could whine about it, but that's a waste of time. We're not in charge of Google. Or we could find a way around it, a way that you could actually get information that's true. It's not intentionally deceptive. And the way to do that on YouTube, we think, is to subscribe to our channel. Subscribe, and you'll have a much higher chance of hearing what we say, and we hope you will.